I'm Alec Baldwin, and you're listening to Marketing Trends and the Leads Art Week.
Grad Conn has been called a near-perfect example of what a tech company CMO should look like. He's a noble studier of his craft and a history savant, but most importantly, he's an ad man to his core. Grad joined Marketing Trends and discussed his love of marketing, his days as CMO for Microsoft US, and why the industry is undergoing a renaissance. Enjoy this conversation. Marketing Trends Podcast is brought to you by Salesforce. We bring marketing and engagement together. Learn more at salesforce.com/marketing.
Here is your host, Ian Faison.
Welcome to Marketing Trends. I'm Ian Faison, host of Marketing Trends, and today we are joined by special guest, Grad. What's going on?
Yeah, it's really boring. Yeah, this last couple months, not really sure what to do anymore. It's just so plain. Yeah. There's nothing. I mean, the thing. I was talking to someone this morning. I was saying, I had a really awesome marketing plan like 2 months ago, and I've got a new awesome marketing plan now. But it keeps changing, and the dynamic nature of the environment we live in today is pretty exciting. It's always a great time to be a marketer, in my opinion. It's the greatest job in the world, but this is the best time of any time because the new opportunities are being created right, left, and center.
Yeah, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about your career. We're going to talk some Microsoft stuff. We're going to talk about what you got going on at Sprinklr and #Sprinklr life. But first, I want to know, how did you get started in marketing?
Well, my father was a madman. He worked on Madison Avenue at Yonge and Rubicam in the 1960s and 70s. And, had a career that was in other cities after that. But, he was like right at the heart of it then. Had some amazing adventures and stories. And he used to take me into the office. And I'd go in there and walk around and think, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do when I grow up. And the very first book he gave me to read was a book called Scientific Advertising by Claude Hopkins. And Claude Hopkins is generally regarded as sort of the father of advertising, father of demand gen, and generally the first person to really think of advertising and marketing as a selling function and really be able to make advertising work. He worked for Albert Lasker. And if you have time to read Scientific Advertising, you should read it. There's a great book about Albert Lasker called The Man Who Sold America. He actually invented political advertising, he invented orange juice, he invented the feminine hygiene category. He's an amazing advertising person as well. And so I just fell in love with that period of time. And I always thought one day, I'll work in that industry. So I almost, my life's goal for a long time was just to get a job at Ogilvy and Mather. Which is now Ogilvy. But that was it. That was the only thing I wanted in my life. And when I was leaving, graduating from school, going through placement services, I just applied at Ogilvy. And then my girlfriend at the time said, hey, just one application to just one company, really? Like, why don't you throw a few in, like, Procter & Gamble and Nabisco and a few others, Unilever. And so I kind of grudgingly did that, got an offer at P&G. And got an offer from Ogilvy. So I did actually achieve my goal. And I was at Ogilvy because I was torn, because I was kind of digging this P&G stuff too, unexpectedly. And Don Richardson, who was the managing director there, said to me, he said, you can always come to Ogilvy, but you've got one shot to go to Procter & Gamble, and that's right out of school, because they were a promote from within culture. And at that point in time, everyone who started at P&G had to start out of school. And Don said, I went to P&G. I was there for a few years. I learned a ton. And he said, I'll hire you in a couple of years. I'll hire you in a year, like whatever. But you go there, you'll learn a ton, and you can go do anything you want anywhere else. Now, he was right about the second part. I have been able to do a lot of very interesting things. And I do credit my P&G education with that. I mean, it was the best decision I ever made, was going to Procter & Gamble. It was an incredible experience, and I'll never sort of repay them or be grateful enough. The irony, of course, is I never did make it to Ogilvy. and I don't see how that even happens now, because it's not even not even really a business anymore. The agency field's kind of disappearing pretty quickly. But so all that particular dream, while I sort of knocked on the door, I didn't quite walk through it. So, but I'm very, very, very happy with what has happened to me and what's transpired over the course of my career.
That's incredible. So there are not a lot of people who had parents that were actually, on Madison Avenue that went into marketing. I mean, that's like big shoes to fill, right?
Yeah, well, it's like my dad looks at that TV series, Mad Men. He looks at it as a documentary. Although he's just surprised at how light a drinker they are. He uses a word I can't really use on this one. He's like, no, come on, pull it together, get some real drinking done. But no, he had a great time. I mean, he was there during the heyday, and it's all there's like, it's always fun. I was always jealous of my dad in a way, because it's very unique, and it's super fun to be in an industry at the dawn of the industry. Because you're forming rules, you're creating things, and I was always like, God, man, because by the time I got into marketing and advertising, in the late '80s, it was, it wasn't quite so many 3 martini lunches and stuff. Like, we were just like cranking stuff out, making things happen. A lot of the really cool, sort of crazy stuff that they've been doing, it's sort of not worked, and so there's more formulaic, and so I always felt like I kind of missed it. I was like, damn, I like, you read Albert Lasker's books or Claude Hopkins' books, and they were inventing the field, and I was like, wow, that would have been amazing. Then my dad was, there was the TV time. I was like, that would have been amazing, and I was just kind of like, dumpty dumpty dum. And then the web came along, and when I downloaded the NCSA Mosaic browser in February '94. And I quit by the end of that week. I quit P&G by the end of the week, because I thought, this is it. Like, this is my thing that I can do.
Yeah.
And then I ended up doing like 5 startups over a dozen years, got myself technical enough that I could actually get hired by Microsoft Research. So I went to Microsoft Research in 2006 and was there for about 5 years, and then was sort of still markety enough and still technical enough that I could be a CMO. Because the CMO role, what's kind of interesting about that role is it's a role that's become someone who needs to be somewhat technical, at least comfortable with that, or dangerous enough to know a little bit, and someone who just still understands marketing and persuasion and human psychology. And so that's a little bit of an opposite mix. And I've been lucky enough to kind of get that mix, and it's been super helpful for me. So I can drive a product strategy, work really well with product and engineering people, and I can drive a creative strategy and work really well with creative and sort of design people. And that, I like that part of my job. I like being able to be in one meeting that's technical, and one meeting that's creative, and one meeting that's analytical, and one meeting that's strategic. Like, to me, that gets me up in the morning. Someone asked me recently, they said, what's your superpower? I don't love that question, and I don't personally ask that question in interviews and stuff. But this person we were just jamming on some stuff, and they said, "What's your superpower, Grad?" And I thought, I think my superpower might be that I get bored really easily. So I think that might be my superpower, because it kind of like, I have a lot of interests. I can look around a lot, and as a marketer, you're well served to be a generalist with a lot of interests and a lot of passion around a lot of different things.
Well, it seems to me that you are clearly a student of history. And I think that part of the thing for marketing that's been so helpful for the great marketers is to be a student of history, to be a student of, humanity and empathy and those sort of things, but not being draconian in the tools that you go about doing that. Like, I think that, if you were to like kind of miscategorize like the Mad Men genre as something, it would probably be that like they were not excited about like the mediums, although the mediums all became super important and were constantly evolving at that time. It was the classic medium is the message thing that they were more excited about. And I think that that's what you see with marketers now, where I think sometimes, because there are so many channels, there's so many opportunities, there's so many different ways to spend your money with headcount and people and everything, that you can really get so far into the weeds. And your marketing team could just be almost one function, if that's the function that you grew up in, right? If you're a growth marketer, you're just doing that. If you're, a brand marketer, you're just doing that. If you're if you grew up in demand gen, that you're just doing that. And I think that, this idea of like the 5-tool prospect in baseball as like the 5-tool prospect in marketing, is really, it couldn't exist. Like, I don't know how you could have it exist. We have a CMO friend who is interviewing and now is a public CMO. And they're saying that like every single turn, it was like, well, you don't have public CMO experience. And she's like, yeah, but how would I ever get that? Like, if all of you say that exact thing. So I think it's a really interesting time where you see people that are like hyper targeted and good at one specific function of marketing because that's where they grew up.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So let me break that down a tiny bit. So I do love history, actually, and I do read a lot of history. Not because I think it repeats itself. That's a popular expression, but I do think that the themes of history repeat themselves. History itself never quite repeats itself. For example, politically, over the last 3.5 years, there have been frequent. It was not as quite as common right now, but for the first 2 or 3 years of the Trump administration, and I'm not going to get into politics or whatever my politics are. I'm originally a Canadian, so you can probably guess, because right-wing Canadian is far left Democrat here, but I think that it was interesting to me that so many people would sort of constantly compare sort of the rise of, say, the Nazi Party to the election of the Republican president, and I found it was so focused on repetition that it ended up losing impact. And I think generally those were pretty ineffective communications because they were too extreme, right? And they weren't exactly right. And you could draw all sorts of alternative contrasts and stuff. But I think themes in history do repeat themselves, and trends in history repeat themselves. And so there's a fantastic book. I mean, it's and I'm not the person saying this. This is Bill Gates' favorite book, okay? Called My Years at General Motors. And it's by Alfred Sloan, like Sloan Kettering and Sloan School of Business at MIT. That's Sloan. And he was the CEO of General Motors from the early 1930s through the mid 1960s. And by the time that he retired from General Motors, it was the world's largest industrial enterprise. And there was actually an expression in the mid 60s that what's good for General Motors is good for America, right? So it was kind of people I don't think remember that expression anymore, but that was like a thing. And it was also a thing because it was true. so he created this incredible enterprise. And the story of that, if you read the book, he wrote it like a biography, and he was highly criticized at the time for the book, which he wrote in the late 60s, because he writes it like a biography, but there's no mention of his family or going to school or like anything personal at all. But he wasn't trying to write it as a personal biography. He was trying to write it as a biography of his years at General Motors, which is the title of the book. And he wrote it as a handbook for his managers, his leadership team, so they would understand the journey that he went through and they could apply the same lessons, which they studiously went about not doing. And of course, General Motors is not really the entity it used to be anymore. And so if you sort of look at his history, the way he talks about it is it's this history of innovation, but the innovations that they were trying to come up with were a lot around standardization. So, for example, there was no standard for gasoline. Like, what was regular gasoline? It was all over the map. And sometimes it would blow your engine up and sometimes it wouldn't start. They couldn't find tires that would stay inflated for more than 20 miles. That's why you see old cars, they'll have like 4 or 5 spares in the back. They were using them. Like those were active spares. They were using those spares. Just to go on like a country Sunday ride, you'd be going through spares the whole time.
Quick aside on that. So my dad is much older, and he told me that in the summers that my grandma and grandfather used to drive to Yosemite and
Right.
camp in the valley. from Oakland, because she was born in Oakland as well. And I'm like, they drove to the valley, to Yosemite Valley, in a like 1936 like Studebaker or something. Like, how did you do that? Like, I don't even understand how that's possible. Did that take like 15 hours or whatever? It's just funny to think about those sort of things that like that we don't even, riding a car is like completely different than it was then. Anyways, I digress.
Well, it's all relative, right? Like compared to taking a horse and carriage, it probably seemed pretty damn comfortable,
Yeah.
right? But today, you're like, whoa, that's bananas. I'm not doing that in Duesenberg. But anyway, so then, and they were like looking for things like paint. Like, so the reason all the cars were black in the 1920s is black paint was the only paint they could get that would adhere to metal. So there's this massive R&D effort to find multicolored paints that would adhere to metal. That was like a big revolution. And we don't even think about that now. It's like, we don't even know why were they all black. It's because that was the only paint that they could get to work, right? And the list goes on and on and on. The other thing, though, that he talks about in that book is this balance between vertical and horizontal strategic inflections. And so in the early days of any industry, the right way to operate is to be vertically integrated. So Henry Ford, who obviously created the sort of modern auto industry, Henry Ford owned his own forests. He owned his own gum plantations for rubber. He owned, it was a massive one in Brazil, it's still there. He owned his own mines, for iron ore. Like, he was fully vertically integrated. He produced and created every single part of his cars. And in the early days of an industry, that's what you need, because you can't rely on external standardization because they didn't exist. Like, my point being, all these other standards had not yet been created. So you had to basically sort of control all the elements of the input in order to create a product that would have enough quality that would function. And Ford did a very good job of creating a high quality car at a very low price, and revolutionized America and eventually the rest of the world. Where GM did is GM came along a bit later. And by the time GM came along, an industry existed. So there was a service industry that grew up around all the Model Ts and the cars that Ford had created. And when GM looked around, they said, there's enough of an industry now that we don't need to actually vertically integrate the way he has. What we'll do is we'll horizontally integrate. And what we'll do is we'll create a platform that other people can contribute to. And this is the creation of the supplier network, which is the way cars are made today. And that proved to be a superior strategy because it was more flexible and nimble. GM could offer more models, more variety, and start to innovate more rapidly. And so the key innovation, and this always still blows my mind, but to think about this for a second, the big innovation that GM had that pulled them ahead of Ford, and somewhat permanently, was the Chevrolet sedan, which was the first car that had windows and you could close the door and be enclosed. All the cars produced up to that point in time were open cars. I mean, it's almost like hilarious when you think about it. And obviously, a closed car has a significant advantage versus an open car in different types of weather. And so and it was only that car took off. That's what made Chevrolet, and then forced Ford to stop his line, cease producing the Model T, and then he produced the Model A. But it took him an entire year to retool. There were no Fords offered for sale for an entire year, and Ford never caught up again. And their vertically integrated strategy was kind of a continuing weakness for them. And so that's like, okay, but that's been done. Like that, you're not going to learn. There's probably not a new strategy in the auto industry based on that. But how has that been repeating itself in the computer industry? Well, think about Apple. In the early days, Apple was essentially a Ford strategy. It was a vertical standardization strategy. And what did Microsoft do? Microsoft came along and took advantage of the horizontalization that was happening in computers and offered the operating system as a separate component from the hardware. That was a revolutionary idea. And, Microsoft today is still the world's largest enterprise. And I would argue potentially that what's good for Microsoft is good for America. And Apple stayed on their vertical strategy, and they never wavered to the point where they almost went out of business, right? The only thing that saved Apple in the late 90s was Steve Ballmer wrote a $150 million check to Steve Jobs and saved Apple from imminent bankruptcy, right? So if it wasn't for Microsoft, Apple would have gone under. And Microsoft did it for probably good and maybe bad reasons. Good reasons being it's always like nice to, pay forward. Maybe the other thing was, would have been problematic to be the only OS, right? So you wanted to make sure there was some other competition out there from an SEC standpoint. But anyway, so that happened. Apple did survive that because then Apple discovered the next thing. The next thing was digital music. Now, it just so happens that digital music is very complicated because you need to get a song, you need to work with studios or recording studios. You needed to be able to have people download that. You need to have it on a player. You need to be able to sync it with a computer. And there's a reasonable sync is a very hard thing for computers to do, and it's still very hard. And so that benefited from a vertically integrated strategy. Meanwhile, Microsoft, who had had such success being horizontal in the OS area, had taken a horizontal approach in music. And it was failing ridiculously because it never worked properly because they didn't control enough components and nothing ever really worked. They tried to create standards, but the standards didn't stick and there's always variation. And so they couldn't really get those players to work. And Apple came along with the iPod and they blew that market out of the water and then marched on to the next thing. And the brilliance of Steve Jobs' strategy in the late 90s was this idea of the home being a digital hub and a digital entertainment hub created the need for vertical strategy again. And Microsoft never really figured that one out. Now, Microsoft's done a lot of other amazing things. So, I mean, I love Microsoft. But never figured music out, never figured entertainment out. And so what that tells you, though, is that every industry goes through these phases of vertical and horizontal strategic inflections. And so as you're looking at a new industry or as you're in an industry, you always want to think, where is this industry from a vertical or horizontal inflection standpoint? And that's why it's interesting studying history. So it's not so much that, you're going to there's a standardization of gas that's going to happen. It's like you got to think about the overall sort of Uber strategy. And I think in marketing, what's been interesting for me is there's this general attitude people have towards new channels, which I find just almost irritatingly repeated over a very long period of time. So when my father started Young and Rubicam, he was assigned to this he was like the new guy, right? Young guy, and he had red hair. He was kind of crazy, and they always put him on new brands and stuff. And so he was like in the new teams, right? And so when he walked into Y&R, there was the advertising group, and the advertising group handled magazines, out of home. Like billboards and stuff like that. Radio was really big. Newspapers are really big. All that kind of stuff, right? And then on a different floor, like in a corner, it's sort of in some kind of spare furniture and stuff like that. They had this sort of group called the TV group. Okay, because TV was seen as this we can't really measure it. It doesn't have coupons. Does it really work? It's kind of it's kind of a new thing. And so they were over there in the corner. And there were a bunch of kind of long-haired, crazy kids, probably smoking dope. And that was kind of the TV team. Okay, so fast forward, I worked for a while at Gray Advertising, and I walked into Gray. I'd been doing a bunch of startups, and it was 2002. It was a rough time to kind of raise money and stuff, and so I thought I'd take a little bit of a break and scratch my advertising itch, and went into Gray, and I was the head of the Gray Interactive team, which was the web team. And so, similar to my father, there was an advertising group, and the advertising group was print, out of home, newspaper, radio, and now TV was a part of that. And then my team, the web team, was literally on a different floor with literally our own receptionist. Wasn't even part of the main team, right? And whenever they did a pitch, the pitch would be the advertising pitch, and then we would be this adjunct who would kind of come on with this extra web strategy, because this web thing, I don't know, may or may not be a thing. I don't know how to measure it. We didn't really know how it worked. And this is only 2002. This is not that long ago. I mean, it's a few years ago, but it's not that. It's not like 150 years ago. Right? It's just yesterday, really. And so obviously, So now fast forward to today. When I was at Microsoft, I was a CMO for the U.S. company, and so we had an advertising team who were handling print and out of home and newspaper and radio, and TV, right, and web, of course. I mean, obviously we had a website and it was highly optimized. And then I started this social team. Okay. So I wasn't even allowed to put the social team in a Microsoft facility. I had to rent space separately, not Microsoft space, and we had to be off campus in another building, near campus but off campus in another building. And it was a bunch of crazy kids with long hair, and they were smoking dope because, it was legal and because Washington State, and they're all covered in tattoos. Like, it's the same, not that different from my dad's experience, right? But now it's the social thing. And like, I don't know what the next one's going to be, but someone will be telling this story 20 years from now, and they're going to be like, I walked in the advertising team, and it was, print and at home and radio and newspaper and TV and web and social. And over in the corner was the eyeball projection team or whatever the was going to be, right?
Yeah.
And this inability of the industry to completely understand, to embrace new things. I feel like I've always had this tiny advantage because I see a new thing and I jump on it. Whereas a lot of people resist it for a long time, and I think at their peril, because this goes to your point, which is ultimately people over specialize and they become like a TV person, and then people aren't really doing TV anymore. Well, I'm a TV person. Well, no, you're not. You're an unemployed person, right? Or I'm a web person. Well, really, just a web person? You can't do social stuff. Like, you gotta be thinking about, I'm a seller who uses scale tools. And you give me a tool and I'll figure out how to sell on it. And that's got to be your mindset as a marketer. Any marketer who starts to think of themselves in a channel specific way is asking to be put out of work. And then what's fascinating to me is this Facebook generation. There's a whole generation of marketers in the last sort of 5-6 years who grew up just marketing on Facebook. And over the last couple of years, with all the new changes in privacy and all the new changes in the rules that have happened there, a lot of them don't know what to do anymore. And they don't know how to use any other channels, and they can't think about other new channels that are coming out. And so they're lost because they learned one thing, they have to know how to do it, and now they don't know what to do next.
Well, and that's just it, right? I mean, that is the rub, because never before in history have we had this, obviously technology explosion, but technology is fads, right? Like, things become in vogue and out of vogue. Apps become extremely popular and then not popular. The beauty of television was that you could, hit a large swath of people. You weren't just betting on like, I think this 60-minute thing's going to shake out, and I'm going to bet on, I'm going to become a 60 minutes marketer. You know what I mean? Like, there wasn't a way to go a mile deep onto certain of the fads like that. It was more, content driven. And now, you think of how much marketing certain companies do. I mean, I think, what was it? There's like a handful of there's 10 companies who spend over $1 billion a year just on AdWords, and it's like 90% of their budget. And there's one company particularly, I think it's, I don't even know if it's publicly available, but that literally their entire marketing budget is just AdWords, their whole, a multi-billion-dollar business. So it is a fascinating time, and change is constant. I'm curious. So why were you so excited to join Sprinklr, and what does Chief Experience and Marketing Officer mean?
As part of that answer on Sprinklr, I do actually want to address your comment about fads. I'm not actually sure that fads is quite the right way to characterize it, because we are continuously adding new communication channels. So if you read Claude Hopkins' book, right, if you read Scientific Advertising, he will literally talk about the explosion of channels. And he will literally talk about too much advertising and too many messages and too much clutter. Like, all the same things that people complain about today, he was talking about in 1920s, right? So it's all relative, right? And it just, I'm always a little resistant to anything that's never before, or if it's not never before. I'm sure there's somebody in Roman times that's like, man, what's with all this wall stuff, all these wall drawings? Like, it's driving us crazy, like all these advertising. So you have to be careful with that a little bit.
I mean, like MySpace, like Snapchat, you have certain applications that literally can explode overnight. TikTok, Vine, and then like years later, if you had said like, hey, we're just going to become the world's best Vine advertiser, like, and all you did was spend every second, trying to figure out how to make viral Vine videos, you would have been out of business. And then by the time TikTok came back around, you'd be good to go again. So that's kind of my point is like,
well, you're like the program, not the channel. So, but what's interesting is we still have billboards, right? And we still have TV, we still have print, we still have newspapers. We have like nothing's really gone away. We still have radio, and it keeps changing, but nothing goes away. We just keep kind of adding. Like the only things that have really gone away would be silent films. They've gone away, and that was an entire art form. And then some media types, like 8-tracks, and maybe that's it. Maybe cassettes. But even albums, vinyl albums are outselling DVDs now or CDs now. So there's what I think is interesting about humanity is that when we find a way of communicating, we'll really tend to hang on to it. And what's the big change, and this is why I joined Sprinklr, the big change that's occurred is that the 20th century was primarily characterized by innovation in broadcast media, because the telephone was actually invented in the 19th century, right? So the big innovations in the 20th century were television. It's a broadcast medium, which is one to many. Radio, one to many. Radio was kind of a 20th century invention. And although newspapers came from an earlier time, certainly magazines were probably more of a 20th century invention. They existed, but in terms of mass magazines, that was a 20th century invention. That's one to many. The web is one to many. Email has turned into one to many, although it's kind of weird when we think about it. But most email you get from companies says, no reply at company.com, right? So the email is a outbound messaging medium, not as a two-way, although it's obviously well suited to it. And so that broadcast mentality, I think, still infects marketing to a large extent. If you look at the 21st century, and literally the dividing line's a pretty bright line because Friendster came out in 2002, right? It's kind of the first of these. But the sort of bright line between 20th and 21st century is that most of the technology invented in the 21st century is two-way. It's conversational media. So you think about all the social platforms, think about the messaging platforms like WhatsApp and WeChat and things like that. Think about blogs, forums, things like Reddit, and review sites to a certain extent. And so this shift from me being told what to think by somebody to me having a conversation about what's true is a very fundamental shift. And I would argue that customers have fully made that shift, but companies have not. And I think there's a couple of reasons why that's happened. I think there's a general lag. I don't know if you follow Mary Meeker. I'm a huge Mary Meeker fan. Mary Meeker, if you're listening, one of my dreams is, could we just have coffee? I keep trying to get in there.
We'll make it happen. That's what this podcast does. Hopes and dreams.
But Mary Meeker does this thing where she'll identify when people have sort of migrated to a new channel and when companies start to spend on that new channel in the equivalent way. And she does this all the time. It's kind of constantly pointing out sort of opportunities. And my favorite one, because it's fully baked through now, is that in 2006, the number of eyeballs that were on the web became equal to the number of eyeballs on TV for the first time. And 2006 was the year that TV and the web became equivalent, but not on spend, right? Not on spend, but on eyeballs. So behavior precedes spend, right? And so when do you think it was when the spend became equal between web and TV?
And so web counts everything, like it counts Facebook, Google,
advertisers.
I don't know. I don't think it's.
It is.
Is it there?
It was 2016. It took a decade, right? It took 10 years for marketers to adjust their marketing budgets from being primarily TV focused to being balanced between TV and web, even though 10 years before that, they had become balanced. And what she always does is she says, hey, there's an opportunity for the smart company to go in and take a more balanced approach because your competitors are sticking their money against old-fashioned stuff so you can get competitive advantage. And today that's true for mobile. So the gap between spend and essentially eyeballs in mobile is very high. And a lot of companies are still struggling to think about how to spend in mobile. And so coming back to Sprinklr. So I'm, sort of, again, student history kind of thing. I'm just super fascinated whenever there's an inflection point. And you can see that a couple of things are happening as we move away from broadcast media. People are less willing to listen to broadcast messages. So if you say in broadcast, you typically are like, I want you to think this way about me. And in the absence of anything else, people are like, well, okay. Well, I don't know what else I'll say, right? In a conversational media, I will say, this is what I'd like you to think about me. And you're like, well, let me ask you some questions. Let me try to understand that. I'm not sure I believe you. Well, give me some evidence. Give me examples when that was true. And so in conversational media, you sort of have to prove yourself in a different way. The analogy I like to use is comedians. Comedians are my favorite communicators. I watch a lot of comedy. And
well, yeah, you're Canadian. You're like naturally funny. I don't know why.
the accent.
Every great stand-up is like,
yeah, it's all about
Canadian.
the accent. Sorry.
I guess not every, like half of the great stand-ups. The other half are not Canadian, but
I actually have lost a lot of my Canadian accent, and my girlfriend's from Manhattan, so I'm actually losing a bit more rapidly now. But still, occasionally I'll throw an A in there and stuff like that. But I'm getting better. But anyway, so comedians. So comedians are they are wonderful communicators. But imagine that imagine if a comedian did a creative brief like most marketers do, right? And so a marketing creative brief was typically have what do you want to convince people of, right? So the benefit, and then the reason why that's true, and then your brand character. What brand are you trying to communicate? So in a comedian, what's interesting is the brand characters are actually radically different. You have Sam Kinison, you've got very different brand characters, and so they come across as different personas. So those are all different. And the reason why, which is kind of the underlying kind of character of it, also very, very different, right? But the actual communication objective is identical for every comedian, which is super interesting. It's maybe the only area where that's true. It's potentially true in B2B, although they don't treat it that way, but it's totally true for comedians. So in comedians, the communication objective is typically written to convince the audience that, right? So for comedian, it's to convince the audience that I am funny. That's it. That is their sole objective, right? So if a marketer took that, right, a marketer in a broadcast mindset took that, the marketer would take the creative brief and go, okay, great, got it. They'd go to the stage and they'd stand up in front of everybody and they'd say, I am funny. Because that's my message, right? I am funny. And I got to repeat it. I know frequency of about 7 drives memorability. So I'll get that to 7. I'm funny. Yep. I'm funny. I'm funny. I'm funny. And you're trying to get one message, right? I'm funny. Like you hear my message, right? I'm funny. And then I'll get someone else. Maybe I'll get a testimonial. Grad's funny, Maybe I'll hand out some handbills, because multimedia works, right? So Grad's so funny, And so suddenly I have all this like, oh, okay, I got it. So you leave that concert and someone will say to you, hey, how was the concert? And you're like, he said he was funny. Like you got the message, okay? You don't believe it, right? It has had no impact. What does a comedian really do? A comedian stands in the front of the stage and they tell a joke. So they send out a stimulus. When you hear the joke, you laugh, hopefully, you laugh. And while you're laughing, you think to yourself, wow, she's really funny. But you came to that conclusion on your own. She didn't tell you to think that way about her, right? You decided that she's really funny because you're having a reaction that tells you that she's really funny. So it's an honest reaction. So you have a genuine feeling. Okay, so in that context, you come out after the concert and someone will say, how was the act? And oh my God, she was hilarious, right? And you ever just experienced where people will say, oh my, well, like, what were the jokes? Like, what kind of jokes was she telling? And you're like, you don't remember the jokes, right? You're like, there's an octopus and like a mother-in-law and everything's purple, but you can't actually do the act. All you can do is you can genuinely say how the act made you feel. Now, the thing about then that's conversational marketing. And the thing about that is I can guarantee you that no matter how funny somebody is, you're not going to laugh at every one of her jokes. Almost never, right? And not every joke's going to land. And sometimes you might be offended, and not everyone's going to think she's funny either. I mean, in a room of people could all be laughing, and there's going to be someone sitting there saying, this is terrible. I don't like this at all. I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's cool, clever. I don't get it. Okay? Just not my thing. And so the thing about, and I think the mindset issue for companies is that in the broadcast mindset, where I'm telling you how to think, I feel like I have a tremendous amount of control over the message, which is very appealing to a corporate mindset. In conversational marketing, I don't have the same control. And so I take the risk that some people are not going to like it.
You were at Microsoft for a good while, and in the middle of your tenure as CMO of the US business, you had one of the most influential CEOs and founders in the history of the world step down. I'm curious, like, what was it like working with Bill? And then what was it like going through that transition as CMO?
That's an interesting question. So, Bill's an interesting person. My first meeting with him was a month in, and it was a multi-hour screaming match with him telling me and my partner. So I was what was called at Microsoft called two in a box. So you take two GMs and you put them together. Typically, one would be engineering, which was Sean, and one would be sort of product and marketing, which would be myself. And so it was basically a multi-hour screaming match of Bill telling Sean and myself that we were idiots. And his favorite expression is, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." That's how he started. That's literally the first words out of Bill's mouth to me was, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." And so, yeah, it was interesting, and he had a big impact on the company because, he pushed people really hard. And if you didn't defend and fight back, then, he didn't take your idea seriously because you couldn't defend it. Then, he passed on the reins to Steve, and Steve had a very, 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 very difficult job. And I want to explain that in a second. And then Satya sort of took over and I think has brilliantly leveraged the existing culture of Microsoft to morph it into something a little bit newer. And so the interesting thing is that, Bill exited at a moment in time when the businesses of Microsoft were at their nadir, right? And so they needed at that point to move into a new area. And so I think people are probably aware of this, but I'll just point it out for clarity. So it's very unusual for tech business to be able to leap from one business model to another. Google still search, very vulnerable. And they've tried like crazy to get out of it, right? They've tried like crazy to start other things, but they've not been able to build anything similar to their search business. Microsoft was OS. OS isn't even really a business for them anymore, but that was the business. They made the amazing leap to productivity, right? Which is still a huge business for them. But that OS to productivity leap, that's like not as common as people always take it for granted. Like, oh yeah, Microsoft did Office and they did Windows. That's like really crazy that a company can do two things like that. And then what Microsoft's had to do is a third leap. And that third leap is almost unprecedented. There are almost no companies have ever done that. And the third leap was to the cloud. And so I was there from 2006 to 2018, which is essentially beginning of the cloud. Like I launched the very first cloud app. Microsoft Health Vault was the first cloud app. It was launched out of the Virginia Blue facility, which was the first, what was effectively Azure facility. Called it Blue at the time because Azure's cooler now. And so, from the very beginning to like where they are now, which is basically a cloud company. And so Steve had the brutal job, the thankless job of essentially building out the cloud infrastructure for the company and making that transition. And, he hid it for a long time underneath Bing. People are like, why are you investing in Bing? He wasn't investing in Bing. He was building out Azure. And I think Steve did an absolutely brilliant job. I think Steve's one of the great business leaders in the history of America and probably the most underappreciated. Sure, did he make some mistakes? Yeah, okay, show me a single executive who hasn't made some bad bets. But he made an amazing bet, which was the cloud bet that Microsoft made saved the company, has put it in a position which is unparalleled. And no one's made three transitions like that before. No one has ever done that. And so then Steve was able to hand off a very functional company to Satya. And Steve also held back a lot of stuff. So my favorite thing about the Satya transition, there's one thing Satya did and one thing Steve did. My favorite one was like Satya came in CEO, and by the end of that first month, we launched the Office apps into the Apple Store and into the Google Store for mobile. And those are still the top apps on both the Android and iOS platforms. And everyone was like, thank God Satya finally got out these iOS things and made them happen. And I always think, what did people think happened there? They think that Satya coded those things up on a weekend and then sent them out at the end of the month? Of course not. Steve started those projects in 2008. the year after the iPhone came out.
Yeah.
And I had friends who were working on those projects starting in 2008. It took years to build those apps because they were essentially Office from scratch in the iOS platform. It's an extremely difficult project, and Steve held it back. And actually, there's a lot of innovation and a lot of announcements that came out in the first few months of Satya's reign, which were all just held back by Steve, and he essentially gifted them to Satya, who could then get a really great momentum behind him. The thing that Satya did, which I also think was brilliant, is he did a cultural shift. Because the problem in the culture at Microsoft was that, Microsoft's sort of full of smarty pants, right? And there's like smart people are great, and smart people there's a double-edged sword there, right? Which is smart people can be a lot of fun, smart people can be a pain in the ass. And so the culture had acquired this know-it-all attitude, and it was a know-it-all attitude that was endemic internally and also externally. And we showed up that way in front of customers. And customers don't particularly enjoy being told that they don't know what they're doing. And so it had a big impact on us in a negative way. So what Satya did is he said, I got to change this culture. And it was beautiful because he was from inside it. But what he knew he couldn't do is he couldn't just switch it to something new. He had to stay within the family. And so if you think of a coin of what smart people value being able to show people that they're smart, and smart people value learning. That they value both things. So they're two sides of the same coin. And so Satya's very first memo as CEO, he said, we need to shift from being a know-it-all culture to being a learn-it-all culture. And learn-it-all and know-it-all, very tightly associated, and people were able to make that mental shift. And then Satya himself modeled it. And he takes like classes at University of Washington. He's learning all the time. He's reading all the time. And that was a wonderful shift because it softened the edges of the company and allowed the company to maintain its integrity as being a bunch of smart people, but also being able to be learners as opposed to having to prove what a bunch of smarty pants they were. And I think that's one of the great business stories. And I will say that it's still a little frustrating to me. I think Microsoft's getting a bit more credit now, but it is frustrating to me that people tend to talk about sort of Google and Facebook and sort of the sort of sexier valley companies and leave Microsoft out of the equation when what Microsoft has done is so unprecedented and so amazing. And three incredible leaders, Bill, Steve, Satya, like that's who's ever strung together that kind of set of CEOs. And then I'll say it again, I'm repeating myself here, but I'm just going to say it one more time. It's like the way Steve has been treated is outrageous. And I think that someone has got to write a book about what he really did and how he saved the company and saved the future of the company and saved, millions of jobs and really did an incredible service to humanity. And I know he's been financially rewarded for it because all his stock is just Microsoft stock, but it's not the same. I mean, someone's got to recognize at some point that this guy did something that no one's ever been able to do before.
So it's been said that Grad Conn is a near perfect example of what a tech company CMO should be like. I'm curious, what do you think a tech company CMO should be like?
Tom said that. That was a really nice thing for Tom to say. What Tom is referring to when he said that is that I think he was both stunned by how long I had lasted. I think that's mostly his take on it, because it is tricky to keep your job as a CMO for very long. But I think the core of it was that he saw me using technology and using communication channels as a user as well as the exploiter of, right? And so I think a lot of CMOs don't live the reality of their customers, and they don't communicate and write and stuff like that. And so, to me, I think that there's it is funny because I do sometimes get sort of blowback on the fact that I run my own blog, right, and I have my own opinions. They're not particularly controversial, like cool marketing ideas and stuff like that. But it's not. There is like, well, why don't you just do stuff that's like Sprinklr only? And I actually think that to be a really good CMO, you've got to be a learner and you've got to be pushing yourself to look at new things. I just wrote an article for Adweek, which I'll put on my blog. There's a slightly longer version I'm going to put on my blog once the Adweek article is published. But it's about a restaurant in Seattle called Canlis. And Canlis has been doing some very, very interesting things in these pandemic times, and they are doing these interesting things, and those are getting picked up and socially amplified, and Canlis is like doing better than ever, which is amazing. Not many restaurants can say that. And so I wrote an article on that. Now, what does that have to do with Sprinklr? Well, it's got social component to it and stuff like that, but I'm not selling Sprinklr at all in that article. In fact, Canlis is not a Sprinklr customer. It just happens to be someone I think is doing a really cool job of connecting product and marketing in a really cool way and leveraging sort of the modern world we live in. And I think that makes me a better CMO for Sprinklr, because I can think about where things are going. I can have broader conversations, and I can have a more expanded universe in the way I approach things. But not everybody does that. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody thinks that way. And not everybody even accepts that. Some people think that you should just be talking about your company. I think the problem is that just makes you kind of boring. If every single thing out of my mouth was Sprinklr, 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 you wouldn't want to talk to me. Just be like, because you know what I'm going to say. Like, what do you think of the, pick your favorite team. What do you think of the Dodgers? Sprinklr. So it's like, okay, dude, I'm not going to ask you questions anymore. Like, you're wasting my time. And so I think you have to have, broad interests. You have to be able to look afar in the field. And then when I do talk about Sprinklr, you're going to be more willing to listen. You're going to take it more seriously. You're going to see it's coming from a place of thoughtfulness. I didn't go to Sprinklr because I needed a job. I went to Sprinklr because I was their first customer. I'd worked with them for many years. When I moved to New York, I wanted to be with people who I believed in and with something that I believed in. Well, so when I tell you that I think Sprinklr could do something to help you, you're going to listen to me because I've used it. I'm a user. I use it today, obviously. It's how I run my business. And you can sort of take that seriously. If I just come across like I'm shilling you, and it's just something that I'm selling, then you're just going to be like, you're going to turn me off. And I think today, more than ever, going back to the whole conversation about broadcast versus conversations, true conversational marketing is that you are a sparkling conversationalist. And when I meet you at a party, if I only just talk about Sprinklr the whole time, you're not going to want to talk to me at the party. And that's what real life is like now, too. The broadcast mindset is I should just blast out messages about Sprinklr. But that is, kind of a bankrupt philosophy now. So I think that's sort of where Tom was going. And I that's kind of my philosophy, is that to be a good marketer, you need to be a generalist. You need to have a lot of interests, and you need to engage across the media that you believe in, that you talk about, and you need to engage your customers where they are. Now, that's hard because we're busy and there's lots of stuff going on, and I'm better some weeks than others. And I went through kind of a multi-month period over the last year where I didn't post a lot because there's a bunch of stuff going on in my life and I just didn't get to it. And that's all right. I mean, the one thing I don't do is I never apologize for frequency. There's the most popular post on blogs. This is a Boing Boing article. The most popular post on blogs, the most posted post on blogs, is a post that says, "Sorry, I haven't written in a while." So I never do that. I stop, I'll start, whatever it is, I just do it. But it is important to keep going.
Do you find that, kind of in your trajectory that, if you're going back and, looking at your time as CMO of Microsoft US, I'm sure you had, a huge budget, although probably not as big as people think. Mm-hmm. Everybody always says that. They're always like, it was way smaller than you'd think. Maybe there's somebody out there who's like, no, trust me, my budget's way bigger than you think. And now, being a company that is a vendor to other CMOs, to marketing teams, being a resource to that, how did that kind of shift your mindset? How would you go back and sell to Grad, 6 years ago?
That's an interesting question. So the interesting thing about Microsoft, the joke about Microsoft is that Microsoft has really deep pockets. I think that's a true statement. I don't think anyone can argue with that. So Microsoft has really deep pockets, but really short arms. And so, and the way that they implement short arms at Microsoft is that no one team really gets enough budget to do everything that they need to do. So you have to partner with other teams. And what it does is sort of creates this dynamic partnering motion inside the company. So my budgets were actually huge, but they were put together with lots of other teams. So I had one budget, and my customer experience center budget was 34 different budgets. One was mine, and then 33 other groups
Wow.
contributed to it. And the reason the company does that is that if you can create the company can't, if the company is very much a marketplace driven company, it doesn't believe in centralized planning in many ways. So for example, there's no career planning at Microsoft. There's a career site. And if you want a new job at Microsoft, you go find yourself a new job at Microsoft. It's kind of like you just do it. You don't have to tell your manager. You just go find a new job. And so, but there's no career path for you. Like they'll move you around and stuff if you ask, but you have to kind of drive it yourself. Which initially, when you first get there, is a little terrifying, but ultimately you really like it. The budget thing is the same thing, which is if I come up with a really cool idea that I think could benefit a number of different parts of the company, and I can convince them that's a good idea, they'll join in and they'll throw some money in. And so you can build very, very large budgets by driving cooperative motions, which is a good thing for the company. The company wants that. And so the company essentially underfunds everybody in order for people to force themselves to pool together. So that's kind of how it works. And so for me, what's helpful in terms of selling to me is sell me in a way that allows me to convince other teams to join in, right? So and understand that I am trying to influence many other people in the process of creating this. And so I think potentially the mistake some vendors make is they make one of two particularly significant errors. One is assuming somehow I control it all. And so they don't make it easy for me to bring in others or show how to bring others in. Or B, they think they need to sell everyone individually themselves, which is actually the worst part. Because then I find myself being end run by the same vendor that I'm trying to do a deal with, and that's not good. So really being able to kind of create an understanding of who your champion is. So you will have a champion. I would be an example of a champion. Understand who your champion is, and then support that champion to bring others on board. That's a not well practiced skill in B2B selling. Something we do at Sprinklr, though. My CRO is Luca Lazaron, probably one of the best, most brilliant CROs in the world. Guy's incredible. One of the great gifts of my life is to work with Luca. And he's a fantastic at coaching his team on how to identify and find champions, and then how to build champions and how to support champions and how to support them within their organization so that they're able to build organizational momentum. Because we almost exclusively work with large multinational firms at Sprinklr. We don't work with anyone who's less than $1 billion in revenue. And so inevitably, anyone that we're working with is part of an ecosystem. And we have to be really successful because our product helps join silos and helps unify organizations. Then we're not going to do a very good job of unifying an organization if we're not working across a number of different organizational boundaries. But we're better to do that with a champion than to try to just randomly call people up on our own.
Well, Grad, you're our champion for today because it has been awesome talking to you. I think that you set the record for least number of questions asked in our question list going into it, which is always means it's a great conversation. We got to have you back. There's tons of stuff that we can bring you back for because there's just too much good stuff to share with our listeners.
Happy to do it anytime. And as long as the pandemic continues and my hair continues to grow, you might get back to shoulder length hair again. So we'll see what happens.
There's so much about marketing that is trying to figure out ways to, we had Jonathan Mildenhall, the former CMO at Airbnb. He came on the show and said, marketing is about earning a disproportionate share of conversations. And I think it's something that you touched on a bunch of times today. And wow, how important is it to earn conversations in a time like this where people's focus is so different than it's ever been? And I think, you dropped some real knowledge here on that. I will say, so actually, before we get out of here, final thing, we always do a lightning round, fast and easy questions. And the spot is brought to you, as always, by Salesforce. But I do have one lightning round question for you. What's your best advice for a first-time CMO?
My best advice for a first-time CMO is to pick a single battle and win it. Stay very focused. It's the temptation is to try to fix everything at once because I can tell you everything will be broken. But just pick one and fix it, and then you'll get the permission to do more.
Well, that's our lightning round for today. You can go to salesforce.com/marketing to learn more. We love them. They've been here since the very beginning of Marketing Trends. Grad, that's it. That's all we got for today. Any final thoughts? Anything to plug here?
No, that's actually really cool. I like that Salesforce, because their interface is Lightning, is doing the lightning round. That's actually very clever. I really like that a lot. I've never heard that before. Salesforce is a great partner of ours. Salesforce is my back end, one of the great companies in the world. So that's really neat. I had a really good time, and my overall lesson for everyone is be a learner, and you can be a learner one of two ways. Like, one is you should learn yourself, always be reading new things, absorbing new things. It doesn't have to be about marketing. You can just be reading, but always be reading, always be learning, but also always be teaching. Because when you teach others, you actually tend to learn a thing better yourself. There's an expression which is, there's nothing like teaching a thing to learn a thing. And if you're always teaching and you're always learning, you'll never be bored, and you'll never be obsolete. And the worst thing in the world is to be bored or obsolete. And those are things that are very, very important to avoid in life. And you can become bored and obsolete very young in your career. And so I've seen people in that stage very, very, very young, and it's a terrible waste to see. So stay on the edge by teaching and learning.
I love it. Grad, thanks again. This was awesome. We got to have you back soon.
Stay safe.
Marketing Trends Podcast is brought to you by Salesforce. Discover marketing built on the world's #1 CRM, Salesforce. Put your customer at the center of every interaction. Automate engagement with each customer and build your marketing strategy around the entire customer journey. Salesforce. We bring marketing and engagement together. Learn more at salesforce.com/marketing.